A long time ago in Tiso, a small nation in the east, a maiden of the heavens descended to the land below and fell in love with a mortal. Their children, who inherited their mother's beauty, made their home in the realm of mankind and came to be known as the Yul people. Their unearthly beauty proved to be more of a curse than a blessing, for they were ravaged by greedy humans and their numbers drastically declined. This was no exception for the last surviving daughter of the Yul, summoned by the emperor to wait and serve at his pleasure. Presently, the emperor lounges with a woman all smiley. When the woman inquires about his mood, he informs her that there's someone else he's looking forward to meeting that night. Just then, a servant steps in to inform him that the Yul girl has arrived, so he immediately springs up and orders the other lady to leave. However, the servant hints that there has been a slight issue, but the emperor, unaware of what the issue might be, seems pretty happy as long as the Yul girl is finally there. As the girl walks in, his brow furrows in anger at the sight of her face. To his surprise, the girl's face is partly tainted. As if that was not enough, the servant informs him that when the girl's mother heard of his order, she could not contain her rage, so she did that to her daughter's face. Trembling, the girl bows and starts pleading for mercy on her mother, but the emperor bursts into laughter and then orders the servant to end her life and bring him another Yul girl. In fact, this time around, he orders for all the Yul women, particularly the girl's mother. Surprisingly, the servant reveals that the girl is the last of the Yul because after she was taken, the remaining people took their lives. Shocked by this sudden news, she questions the servant, inquiring if this means that her mother is no more, but he cautions her against raising her voice in the presence of the emperor. All the while, the other lady still remains in the room and the emperor reaches for a sword and angrily slays her, saying that he told her to leave, but she obviously flouted his orders. So, the emperor turns to the servant, whom he addresses as chief eunuch, and tells him to find any possible survivors of the Yul, but until then, the girl should remain alive. And so begins the tragic story of the last remaining Yul. 10 years later, that girl, now known as Concubine Seal-Hasian, the last of the Yul, still has her life revolving within the confines of the harem. She's seen with her maid, who she's lecturing on addressing her informally. As the maid helps her dress her hair, she's astonished by how big the lady has grown, and Sealha responds by reminding her that she's been in the harem for almost 10 years and it won't be long until she can finally leave the palace. She seems pretty happy about that. However, she knows that the only way for a concubine to leave the palace is to become a nun, and she's not sure the maid would want to join her. After her maid, Unjong, is done doing her hair, she asks her if she thinks her mother knew that the horrific scar she inflicted on her would be the key to her survival at the harem. But Unjong holds her, reassuring her that it won't and she'll finally be free. Also, she adds that all she wants is to live in peace with her. Sealha starts venting to Unjong, saying that she's tired of enduring the emperor's endless tyranny and putting up with the scorn of the courtiers. She says she'll try to endure it as best as she can and hopes that nothing happens the next time the emperor summons her to his bedchamber. She adds that if her virtue remains untouched, they will be able to leave the harem once and for all. She even suggests going somewhere far away and never returning. Suddenly, they hear some noise and Sealha mentions that it seems Prince Muan has returned from war, and then she inquires if he's the one they refer to as the demon, but Unjong warns her against speaking in such a manner because even the walls have ears. It is known that whenever the prince visits, the winds of death sweep through the Imperial palace. Just then, one of the eunuchs dashes in, calling out Sealha's name and informs her that the emperor summons her. She's left in shock with this news. As she arrives at the emperor's presence, he hushes her amid her greeting. Turns out he summoned her to make jest of her tainted face in front of the other concubines. This goes on for a while until he suddenly remembers that she's expecting to leave soon and suggests that perhaps another person can put his seed in her since he's unwilling to. She expresses her gratitude for his words and reveals that she would like to enter the service of Lord Buddha, but before she can complete her statement, he immediately declines the idea and grabs her hair. Still pulling her hair, he says that he can't possibly let her out of his sight because she brings him greater joy in his bedchamber. However, Sealha remains steadfast in her plea and wish to enter the monastic life. Just then, a servant interrupts with the information that Prince Muan has arrived. After hearing this, the emperor tosses her away, but just as she steps outside to leave, he calls her attention saying that he has changed his mind. Then, he directs her attention to the prince, revealing that he's his twin brother and the only man who dares breach his harem with his soldiers in tow. Furthermore, he mentions the rumors flying around about him and throws subtle threats about ripping the tongues of those who spread the rumors. With his hand around her neck saying all this, she flinches upon hearing that part, causing him to inquire if she's frightened. After that, he compliments her pleasant scent, which he thinks is in contrast to her face. As the prince calls him out, he discharges her immediately. Just as Sealha walks past the prince on her way out, he displays acts of a gentleman by letting her go by first, and then he notices the scar on her face and remarks that the pain must have been excruciating, judging from the scar. As if that was not enough, he calls her brave and then excuses himself to meet with his brother. As Sealha continues her walk back to her quarters, she reminisces on the harsh words of the emperor and the surprisingly sweet words from his twin brother, Prince Muan. As she approaches her quarters, she meets Unjong looking so worried but assures her that she's fine, so there's no need to worry. Just then, Sealha shares that she saw Prince Muan earlier and also all he said to her, which seems just as if he has known her all along. So, she grazes her face and asks Unjong how the scar is and if she thinks it has faded a little. In response, Unjong leans closer to her face and says that she thinks they can give it some more time. Suddenly, the door slightly opens with a figure peeking at them, their faces beaming with smiles as they realize it's Hoong, their friend who has come bearing food. As they sit to have the meal, Sealha pats his shoulder saying that he can always stop by any time to see them even without such gifts, as she doesn't want to get him into trouble. To respond, he gestures to her and she surprisingly takes out every word from his mouth, leaving Unjong baffled. Turns out that the young boy is unable to speak. Just as Sealha is about to take a bite, a voice echoes yelling and questioning why the young boy would steal the emperor's gifts to her. The boy, on the other hand, immediately springs up from his seat and trembles to the ground looking all scared. But the lady, who is one of the concubines of the emperor, continues yelling at him, so Sealha intervenes and tries to defend the boy by reminding the other concubine that this is her quarters. Raging with anger, the lady continues to explain that the boy has been pilfering food and jewels away from hers and now she finds him stepping into Sealha's gate with them. However, Sealha still insists that he can't do such a thing and that he only took pity on her and brought her the food, but before she can finish her statement, the concubine stomps on the boy's head and orders the other guards to take him away while she threatens that he'll lose his hands and be sent out of the palace. As the guards prepare to take him out, Sealha rushes ahead of them pleading with the concubine to have mercy on the poor mute boy. She even goes as far as offering herself for the punishment instead, and to her surprise the lady whispers in her ear, reminding her of a previous event. Still, that did not stop Sealha's plea. Just when the lady lays out the punishment to be given to the boy, she goes on her knees still pleading for mercy upon him. And so, the lady finally accepts to reduce his punishment to 30 blows of lashing. Weeping intensely as the lashing begins, Hoong slumps to the ground. The poor boy can't withstand all the punishment. So, Sealha begins rummaging, looking for a means to regain his consciousness, and then she takes out a knife saying she's the only one who can save him. Do you think she's got some superpower in her? We learn that a long time ago, a curious maiden of the heavens descended to the earth, where she happened upon a mortal who had been fatally stabbed. The heavenly maiden cut her flesh and gave the man her blood to drink, for it contained the power to heal all wounds. The Yul were her descendants, and of them, Sealha was the only one who inherited her enchanted blood. After she's done aiding Hoong, Unjong tends to her injury from cutting her flesh. She recalls that Unjong was the first human she'd tried healing, and before her, it was only wild animals, and it also took her 3 whole days to recover then. However, Unjong still thinks Sealha shouldn't be doing such things in the palace, but considering the poor boy's family, she had no choice. As Sealha wanders her quarters at night, a voice draws her attention from across the fence. She glances in the direction and sees a hand waving at her, so she goes closer to greet the man. They exchange pleasantries and he informs her that he caught a rabbit and set some aside for her, and so he passes to her through a small opening, regardless of the fact that it could get him in trouble. As they engage in a little conversation, Prince Muan steps in behind the man, mentioning that an outsider is trading whispers in the night with the Emperor's concubine. On hearing this, Sealha immediately recognizes that the voice belongs to the prince, so in order not to put the man in more danger, she quickly resorts to making sure she doesn't get caught too. In a sneaky manner, she dashes off, but amid her escape, the prince sweeps her off the ground and takes her back across the fence. He expresses his delight in their meeting again, but she remains steadfast in pointing out that the man is innocent. She further explains that he's just a kind soul who was generous enough to help a starved concubine, but the prince questions if she's not aware of the risks involved. As he takes closer steps to her, he mentions that upon a closer look, she seems to have grown more haggard since they last met, but she relentlessly pleads for mercy. Then, the prince asks her whom she's pleading for and advises that she pleads for her life and not the man's, only then shall he turn a blind eye to the incident. Grappling with the possibility of him fulfilling his words, Sealha decides that she should not trust him, with a strong belief that he's just like his brother, the Emperor. So she decides to play the blackmail game on Prince Muan by telling him that if he ends the life of the man, she'll confess before the Emperor that he attempted to defile her virtue and also murdered the gamekeeper who tried to stop him, and he'll be brought to justice for coveting the Emperor's woman. After hearing these words, the prince scoffs and mentions that she might just be the fiercest creature he has ever hunted, but Sealha insists that if she's going to lose her life, she'll drag him with her, though the prince doubts that his brother will even believe her. She begins crying as she inwardly remarks that he's toying with her and enjoying it, and then she remembers their first encounter and notes that she shouldn't expect anything more from him. Meanwhile, Prince Muan just continues to stare at her as she weeps uncontrollably. As he watches her cry, he finally decides to yield to her terms and orders his servant to give the man a stern warning and let him be on his way. Still holding the bag of meat in her hand, Sealha smiles and waves at him as he walks away before she suddenly staggers. Unexpectedly, Prince Muan catches her and warns that it's too early to let her guard down because he could always change his mind. So, he hugs her with hopes that it won't be considered as defiling her virtue, but she hastily pulls out of his hug saying he should let her go, to which he obliges with a smirk. Then, she walks toward the fence, but he's forced to ask if she will be able to climb over the fence, considering he was the one that brought her over. After responding that she won't be able to climb, she requests that he escort her to her quarters. To her surprise, he lifts her up in his arms and heads to her quarters while she keeps pleading for him to put her down because she thinks there will be trouble if someone sees them in that position. But he assures her that if anyone sees them, they'll meet their end before they even have a chance to scream. After a while, he bursts open the door to her quarters, startling Unjung, who quickly bows to greet Prince Muan, mistaking him for the Emperor. As Sealha bows to thank him and wish him a good night, she notices him ripping some of his clothing. Filled with shock, she looks away, pleading for him to leave and also begging for his forgiveness if she had ever offended him. Before she can even say another word, the just bursts open with other eunuchs coming in with a deer tied. After dropping the animal on the ground, the prince instructs them to build him a fire, and then he takes out a knife and slices the animal open. As if the drama is not enough, he pours some of the blood of the animal into a bowl and orders Sealha to drink it herself, else he'll have to open her lips and feed her himself. So, she hesitantly accepts the bowl and gulps down every drop of it. Just then, the prince reveals that some people say it was customary for a man and his wife to share deer blood in a kingdom he conquered not long ago. However, Sealha responds by saying that this isn't one of his conquests. Besides, she's a concubine of the Emperor, so he should have some respect. She warns that the Emperor will have her head if he learns of this incident, and her blood will be on the prince's hands if that happens. She even threatens to hunt his dreams for the rest of his life, but he laughs at her words and jestfully says that it's a wonder she's managed to survive thus far with such a glib tone. He turns to her, telling her to admit that she needs an ally in the palace, so she should allow him to be one. Surprised and lost in her musing, Sealha questions if their fates would have been any different if she had managed to escape back then. Cutting her musings short, the eunuch informs the prince that the meat is ready, so he wipes off the blood stains from her hand while urging her to eat her fill. Left with no choice, Sealha urges Unjong to eat, though she is hesitant about the whole situation. So, Prince Muan passes her a huge price of meat, which she immediately starts digging into and even suggests they set some aside for the ailing young boy, Hoong. The name seems to ring a bell to the prince, so he probes further and Sealha explains that he's a eunuch boy who was assigned to her quarters not long ago. Turns out that one of the eunuchs who accompanied the prince to her quarters is the brother whom Hoong said left for the war. The eunuch swiftly runs to Unjung's bedchamber to see his brother, who is still fast asleep from the treatment Sealha administered. So, he inquires what his brother is doing lying down in there and also reveals that it was for his sake that his brother decided to work in the palace, but he did not expect to find him like this. Sealha assures him that his brother will be alright and that he's just asleep, but the young man leans closer, demanding to know exactly what happened to his brother. Just then, Prince Muan calls him back to order, causing him to render apologies to Sealha for his unprofessional behavior. Out of her goodwill, she begins explaining that the concubine his brother served previously gave him a light beating, so she gave him some sleeping draught for his healing, and she assures him that he'll wake up soon. She also promises to let Hoong know that his brother visited him once he wakes up. After Hoong's brother bows to thank her, she sits reflecting on his presence there and deeming fate indeed strange. Prince Muan notices her mood and questions if something is wrong because she seems to be deep in thoughts, and she replies by saying that she fears his presence will invite the emperor's wrath. In response, he assures her not to worry about such things. After all, he promised to be an ally. She, on the other hand, thanks him and reveals that her days in the palace are coming to an end, so she won't be needing an ally. However, since that is yet to come, he advises that she get used to him in the meantime because she's going to need him. In the next scene, Sealha is seen in the emperor's chamber and he ponders on the relationship between her and his twin brother, Prince Muan. Suddenly, he calls for her presence beside him and points out that there happens to be an open seat for her. Wow, I think he's trying to spite his brother. As she takes her seat close to him, he keeps on touching and brushing her face with his hands, claiming to truly cherish his concubines. He informs her that he had her outfit tailored to resemble the regalia of the Empress, but now he feels he should have had her dressed in the garbs of the courtesan instead, which he considers a more fetching sight. Ordering her to rise, he says that since this is a banquet organized for his generals who have distinguished themselves on the field of battle, a special introduction is in order. Then he shoves her ahead and introduces her as the last of the Yul. Surprised, one of the generals mentions that the Yul slaves of the Imperial city all took their own lives after learning that their people had been decimated. They jest at her for a while, and to Sealha's surprise, the emperor kicks her down the stairs right in front of her. He mentions that with the rest of her people demised, he is left with no alternative but to keep her with him. This sight bothers Prince Muan so much that he rises and steps towards Sealha, asking if she's sure she doesn't need an ally. Then he grabs and lifts her up from the ground, whispering that she should not be afraid. So Prince Muan holds her as he bows to his brother, apologizing for daring to lay hands on his fair concubine. He explains that he simply could not neglect a beautiful woman in trouble, and so, the emperor accepts. After all, the banquet was thrown in honor of the prince, it's only fair things go his way, right? Secretly gripping his chair in anger, the emperor permits them to leave. A while later, Sealha's hurting leg is being attended to by a servant, but amid that, the door slams open and the emperor bursts in, romancing another concubine. Sealha and the servant immediately bow to greet him and he orders them out of the room, but just as they are leaving, he halts them and asks for Sealha to stay back. As his intimate moment lingers, he even urges the concubine to look at Sealha's face, calling it a beauty beyond compare. As if that is not enough torture already, he orders Sealha to look at him since it's the only thing she's good for, but she hesitates, thus angering him. He reiterates by yelling that she should look at him, which she quickly obeys with tears rolling down her cheek. A few moments later, he calls her a worthless girl as he makes his way out of the room, leaving her with the concubine who's bent on giving Sealha a price of unsolicited advice. Even after Sealha makes it clear that she cannot hear any of her advice anymore, she still continues to say that the emperor may seem cold, but it doesn't mean you can't earn his favor, after which the door shuts behind her. With the thought of Unjong being worried sick about her absence, Sealha hastily limps out of the room, causing her to trip at the entrance, but fortunately, Prince Muan is there in time to stop her from hitting the ground. He mentions that she hurt her ankle at the banquet and he's been worried, so she thanks him for his help earlier. To her surprise, he mentions that the emperor cannot stand so much as the thought of having her in his bed, yet, there she is, doused in his scent. Defensively, she tells him that the emperor can barely contain his disgust whenever he catches a glimpse of her face, and not everyone has a strong stomach like him. However, the prince probes further, asking why the emperor always calls her into his bedchamber each night, as he's eager to know exactly what she's capable of. At that moment, she starts venting, saying that she loathes it too, and that she's had to suffer the emperor's torment ever since she came of age, but left with no choice, she has to obey. Furthermore, she adds that the other ladies of the harem despise her for this, and she's had to live a most lonesome life, thanks to her hideous scar, and now she's a pariah because of something beyond her control. Amid her rant, he holds her and licks her scar, all to show that it doesn't disgust him. In fact, he says he prefers that half of her face and claims that the emperor and his concubines have no eye for true beauty. Upon hearing this, she slumps to the ground, saying that the prince has no fear at all, considering that this is the Imperial palace, but in response, he remarks that indeed he has no fear, be it in the palace or battlefield. Besides, the worst that could happen is losing one's head. A brief silence envelopes Sealha for a moment as she sits there staring at him, after which she wears a big smile. In another scene, the emperor can't seem to shake off the thought of Sealha from his head. He recalls her presence in the room earlier, though he considers her worthless, he can't seem to cast her aside. Unknown to him, his brother walks in, inquiring what is making him so vexed. He swiftly turns and asks why he's there, and the prince replies by saying that he has come with an amusing story that may be of interest to him. He reveals that it concerns the late emperor's will. He also mentions that before the late emperor passed away, he had a letter delivered to him, and after that, he asks his brother if he isn't curious as to what the will said. With a stern gaze, the emperor scoffs and mentions that the sight of his brother reminds him of a certain concubine who is quite like him in so many ways. Stepping closer, he says that the concubine grates on his nerves, but he just can't seem to get her off his mind, and he's yet to decide what should be done with her. In a sly manner, he whispers in the prince's ear, asking if he has any thoughts on what should be done to this said concubine. Meanwhile, in Sealha's quarters, she's seated with Unjang nibbling on some food. She recalls the incident with Prince Muan, and it somehow enlightens her mood that even Unjang notices. While they are still engaged in the conversation, the door creaks open, and Hoong staggers out. Sealha rushes to him inquiring about his health, but surprisingly, he calls out "my lady," unable to believe that he can now speak. So, she grabs his hands and reveals that she saved his life, but nobody must find out about it, or else they'll all be in danger. She requests that he keep it a secret, which he accepts and promises not to even tell his brother. Just then, Unjong casually mentions that Sealha's powers seem to be growing more potent by the day. However, she's afraid their supposed plan must happen tonight. As Sealha tries to wave it off, Unjong drops the news that the date of the next nightly visit has been announced and it'll be in 3 days, so they can't afford to delay things any longer. With a sad face, Sealha turns to Hoong, suggesting that he spend some time with his family tonight while trusting that he'll keep their little secret. Much later, as she's inside a room, she recalls one question that troubled her mother until the very end. Was this power that heals all but death the key to the revival of their people, or was it a curse upon them? As she moves about within the confines of the room, Unjong's voice comes on offering help, should she need it, but she immediately declines, saying it's not her first time and she's grown used to the pain. We're shocked to learn that she re-inflicts her scar, and that was the plan for that night. As she burns her face with the hot object, she remarks that if the Emperor learns of her ability now, he won't ever let her go. As she screams in pain, her mind wanders to her mother, saying that she can see the truth now, and her ability is undeniably a curse because it forces her to lose sight of the great sacrifice of her people and yearn for death instead. The next morning, Seelha sits in her quarters admiring the weather when Unjong comes in with a cup of tea to aid the pain from her scar. Staring at her, Unjong hopes for a day that Seelha can finally get rid of her scar, but she smiles, assuring her not to worry because she has grown used to it. Still, Unjong isn't convinced. She only wishes that the lady would be more selfish sometimes and stop hurting herself to save anyone else henceforth. Amid their heart-to-heart conversation, Hoong rushes in saying that he couldn't wait to see the lady and Unjong. With a thunk, he drops a bag of sweets on the table and mentions that they are from his brother. Staring at the sweet, her mind wanders back to what Unjong said earlier, but she quickly snaps out of it, smiling at the young boy. On one hand, Unjong notices that the sweets Hoong brought are too much, but he responds by assuring her that they'll all be gone in 3 days because the days are longer in summer, which means that they've got more time to enjoy the treat. Then, he picks up a piece and starts munching on it, but Unjong immediately scolds him for daring to begin eating before Seelha. She warns him not to make such a mistake elsewhere because other people might not be so forgiving. With that being said, Seelha urges everyone to begin eating and make a toast to the long summer days. She hoped the summer sun would continue shining to stall the night forever without the possibility of a tomorrow. That way, she wouldn't have to join the Emperor in his bedchamber or destroy her own face, thus sparing her this agony. Yet, just as the sun never fails to set, that dreaded night inevitably comes too. On the night of the visit, her entire body is scoured and evaluated like some exotic beast being prepared as an offering. After she has been prepared, she walks into the room inquiring, inwardly hoping that the Emperor would cast her out already. To her surprise, when he arrives he requests a lantern, which is quite unusual of him. She thought the Emperor intended to send her away sooner than usual that night. After all, just seeing her face was enough to cool his urges. So, she simply fixated her gaze on the butterflies in the room, hoping she would be permitted to return to her quarters soon. She thought that would be the case until the supposed Emperor before her speaks and she recognizes that the voice is that of Prince Muan and not the Emperor. Strangely, both the twin brothers are present in the room. Prior to that moment, Prince Muan and the Emperor are seated, having a conversation over a drink. The Emperor thanks him for his constant vigilance, thus making the Imperial city peaceful. The Emperor, however, reveals that some people have suggested that the one who dares breach the forbidden harem of the Emperor with his soldier in tow deserves to be punished. He considers this quite troubling because he can't bring himself to punish his own brother who was once hailed as the ideal successor to the throne and still commanding the respect of all the generals, yet doomed to a fate of wandering the battlefield all because of some curse. He mentions that, as his flesh and blood, it is his duty to share in the prince's misery and keep him safe from due punishment. Scoffing, the prince mentions that this is precisely why he's forever indebted to his brother. The fact that even if he marches into his harem with his men in tow, and even if he beds a concubine wed and sworn to him, he cannot lift a finger to stop him. But the Emperor replies by saying that he has more concubines than he can hope to manage, so he doesn't mind sparing a few for his brother. It sounds like he already has someone in mind, doesn't it? She then tells his brother that the girl he has for him is one that only the fearsome demon of war can possibly stomach. He also spills that he desperately needs the girl to beat a child, but he just can't bring himself to do the deed. Snapping his fingers, he asks the prince if he can be of help. Presently, in the room, seemingly lost for words, Sealha just stares at the prince, forcing him to ask if it is his life she fears for or hers. As he speaks, he yanks off her clothes in bits and kisses her while the emperor sits there watching them. Sobbing, she says in his ears that they are going to perish. Acknowledging that fact, he pulls her closer and flips her over to face the emperor, and then he whispers that they must survive together. The emperor rises from his seat, inquiring what they are whispering about, but surprisingly, the prince tells Sealha to plead for her life to his brother. So, he begins whispering what she would say, which she obeys, repeating after him. Unknown to her, this act seems to relive memories in the emperor's head. She continues pleading for mercy until the emperor is forced to leave the room while asserting that she is his concubine, so the child she bears will belong to the imperial family. He also says that once the night is consummated, she shall be his for the rest of her life. Lost in her musings the next morning, she recalls the words of the emperor concerning owning her, that she didn't even realize when Prince Muan entered the room. As she catches sight of him, she springs up from the bed, questioning his presence there and urging him to leave quickly, but he insists that it's natural for a man to seek out the woman he spent the night with. He steps closer and grabs her hand, asking if she did not miss him at all, while also suggesting she just calls him Muan. How would a mere concubine do that? She thinks, but he deems it a special privilege for her since they are in the same boat now. She tries to deny any knowledge of what he's talking about, but he reminds her that he protected her virtue last night and he even lied to the emperor for her. In addition, he hugs her and says he came because he was truly worried about her. Subsequently, he reveals that his brother wants her child, which obviously sounds absurd. She immediately begins to cry, and seeing how much she detests the idea, Prince Muan promises to find her something to purge it, should she ever come to be with a child, and so, she wipes her tears and holds him by his promise. He takes her hand while remarking that he couldn't see her properly last night because of how dim it was, but then, he notices a scar on her hand which looks very similar to the one he has on the same spot too. He casually mentions that he has had it since birth, and people say that the founding emperor also had one alongside some of his descendants. Filled with fear, Sealha suggests he should leave because the sun will be setting soon, but instead, he lifts her up and says that they've already crossed the point of no return. Besides, if their lives are forfeit anyway, they might as well have some fun first. Urging her to hold on to him tight, he sprints and leaps over the fence, revealing her to the setting sun. Now, she wishes she didn't have to go back to the harem, which he fully supports. With a further leap, they arrive before a horse already prepared for them. As they engage in their secret adventure, Prince Muan suggests catching her a tiger or bear, but she insists on not having a taste for needless slaughter. However, he remains steadfast in his belief that it isn't needles. After all, she's an imperial concubine, yet she doesn't have even a pelt rug in her quarters, but once again, she denies having use for such things. After draping his cloth over her, he notes that her skin captures scents with ease, even up to the scent of the man who held her last night. Hearing this, she blushes and slightly shifts away from his body, but he pulls her back and warns against falling off the horse. He urges her to just say the word if she'd like to step down, although it may cut short their little outing. To the prince's surprise, she begins laughing, saying she finds it amusing that they are here now sharing such banter when they are as good as dead. As they go further into the bush, Prince Muan steps down from the horse and orders her to wait there with Arung because it'll chase the other beasts away. As she wonders who Arung is, he explains that it's the name of the horse, who is his faithful comrade on the battlefield. So, Sealha questions the possibility of him hunting in the dark, but he responds by telling her that he prefers to hunt at night because the winds grow calm after sundown, which makes it easier to sense prey. He strokes her face, promising to be back, and then strides into the dark, leaving her in the silence of the night. Noting how quiet it is, Sealha's mind wanders. The thought of running away crosses her mind, but she waves it off, saying she can't just abandon Unjang and Hoyong. Abruptly, the horse starts stomping its feet, leaving her confused and worried until she notices the presence of a tiger stepping out of the bushes. Arung, still trying to scare the tiger away, snorts and tumbles her to the ground, and now she's faced with the growling tiger alone. Tears roll down her cheek due to the fear she's faced with, but suddenly, the prince's voice echoes from behind, directing her to move to her left side. Then, he shoots his arrow at the tiger, piercing its eyes, but this action only angers the animal further. This time around, the prince is left with no choice but to use his sword to confront the animal. After much confrontation, the tiger dashes off back into the bush and Sealha rushes to the prince inquiring about his well-being. However, he notices that she is the one who's hurt instead, but she doesn't even realize it because of how scared she is. Before she can even utter another word, he reaches for her face and begins kissing her, and they both fall to the ground. Their romance seems to be growing with each passing minute. Still lying on the ground, Sealha notes that the emperor must be mad and he shouldn't have left them alone together. She addresses him as Your Highness again, and he reminds her that he told her to call him Muan instead, but how could she dare? He acknowledges the fact that she holds him in many regards but explains that he is but a mere warhound who happens to share the emperor's blood, and one thing she should know about dogs is that they eat and bite and do whatever they please whenever they please. Noting that it isn't a luxury afforded to her, Sealha begs him not to make her regret finding an ally in him. She requests that he must keep them safe no matter what, and not just herself, but all those who serve her. With a subtle gaze, he assures her that if her only wish is to survive, it won't be difficult to achieve. Furthermore, she adds that should the emperor come after their heads, she wants him to protect hers to the last. As he tries to initiate intimacy, she cautions him against the pains from the tainted half of her face, but he goes on about how beautiful that half of her face is. Considering all she has heard about her face, she informs him that others say she's hideous, so he inquires if that includes his brother, who shrivels into himself each time he lays a gaze on her scar. Well, that aside, he considers her a really strange lady because according to him, she should be currying favor with the emperor to seek a position as his own consort and not pleading for her life, but she replies by saying that isn't what she wants. She further explains that greed always demands a price, and it's a price far greater than she could afford to pay. Hearing this, he inquires who told her that, and she responds that it's her mother. With a gloomy face, she mentions that she's afraid of coming to be with a child, but he remains steadfast in his promise earlier made to her, so he urges her not to fret and adds that should she desire it, he can make her empress. After that, he urges her to rest her hands and let the dog do his duty while he pecks and lifts her up. Consequently, he is seen with the slain tiger inquiring if Sealha is awake, but the servant informs him that she's still sound asleep. So he instructs the servant to ensure that she is provided for, as she is, after all, the one he has spent 10 years waiting for. Staring at the tiger, he mentions that the left was stained when he slit the throat and perhaps he should catch another one at the next hunting tournament. A while later, he asks the servant about the Grand Preceptor and if there's any news for him, but he replies saying that he's yet to return, but with his wife confined to her sickbed, he should be back soon enough. Gazing skyward, Prince Muan says the Preceptor is a seer who claims to read the course of the stars, yet he is blind to his own fate. Remembering all the seer said to him a long time ago, he orders the servant to fetch him before his patience runs out. He also vents that he's growing weary of the tiresome curse and his brother's endless provocation. Back at Sealha's quarters, Prince Muan orders his servants to slice up the meat from the slain animal before them for her and also warns them to ensure the pelt is not ruined in the process. He turns to her promising to have a small cloak made for her, but she takes a look at the animal on the ground and asks to speak with the prince privately. After the servants give them their alone time, he asks her what it is that she wants to discuss with him alone, and she reminds him that she told him she has no taste for wasteful slaughter, but he tries to convince her, saying it's for her well-being which she needs to prioritize. However, she still insists that she does not wish to slaughter the precious lives of the animals just to keep herself fed and clothed. Despite all his attempts to make her see reason with him, she warns him to refrain from hunting and assassinating for her sake, but he insists that he can't stop because it just wouldn't feel right. As she walks away, she tells him that she's had enough of seeing the lives of the animals be sacrificed for her sake, and if he insists on continuing, then he shouldn't come to her quarters anymore. In another scene, the prince goes hunting with a servant who notices his demeanor and questions if something is amiss, as he normally never misses a shot but just missed one. He angrily responds that everything is fine, so the servant suggests he pay Sealha a visit. The servant reveals that he heard the gate leading to her quarters has grown quite shabby, so it tends to open on its own in the middle of the night. He also mentions that there are holes in the ceiling of her bathhouse through which the warmth escapes, and without forgetting that there's a 2-year-old wasp's nest in the eaves of her roof. He also says that Hoong tells him that she has been in search of a yellow quilt since last year. After hearing all this, the prince wonders how his servant, Young, manages to understand his brother so easily despite him being mute, but he replies by saying that it isn't difficult, he just simply focuses on what his brother would want instead of what he wants. Taking note of those words, Prince Muan mentions that there seems to be much to prepare for Sealha, so he orders him to arrange everything tonight against their visit to her quarters the next day. Amid the bustling and chattering the next day, the creaks open and Sealha steps out, reminding the prince that she told him not to come by anymore, but just before she can utter another word, she's shocked to see all that they brought to her quarters. After seeing all the renovations being made and her new yellow quilt, she joyfully rushes to give Prince Muan a hug. A while later, as they all dine together, the prince is amazed by the fact that Hoong prepared all the meals, but he continues munching regardless. For Sealha, that day wasn't a particularly nice day, nor was the wound on her face any less painful. The food was the same as usual, and it was a late summer's day like any other, yet she found her heart swelling with joy. The only change was the presence of the man sitting beside her, the prince. With him at her side, she questions if she would have a chance at happiness too. Later that day, after the prince had left, Sealha asks Unjung if she thinks Prince Muan will be coming again, but before she can complete her statement, the sudden announcement of the emperor's presence pierces through the air. Startled by this surprise visit, she asks Unjung if she has received any word of it, but she declines. Irrespective of the surprise, they both bow to greet the emperor, and he mentions that Sealha may possibly be with a child, so she shouldn't be kneeling so readily. Then he instructs her to get up so that they'll talk in her bed chamber. This comes as another shocker to her, causing the emperor to ask if it is wrong for him to visit his own harem, but she responds by saying that she's simply concerned that they're not prepared to receive him. Amid her speech, he shuts her up, orders her to direct him to her quarters, and insists that no one is to enter. As she stands before him inside the room, he glances away and orders her to turn her face away because he can't stand the sight of it. Out of the blue, he questions if she did enjoy her little outing last night, and this question sends chills down her body, causing her to stutter. But the emperor continues, saying that since she is to bear his seed, it's only natural that she and the prince continue to dally together, deeming himself a most generous man. He explains that no other rule will condone a woman of the harem to mother the child of another man, even if he is the emperor's kin. His sly plot is that the public will know her as his concubine and the mother of his child, so she will never be able to set foot outside the imperial palace. Trembling, she pleads that she wants to live in the service of Lord Buddha for the rest of her life. And she will never again trouble him with the sight of her face. However, the emperor asks for something in return if he guarantees her freedom. Promises of a safe haven to call home, being clothed in silk and fed feasts for the rest of her life are made provided she grants him his little favor. To her surprise, he starts by saying that his brother is an eyesore to him, and in fact, the bane of his reign, yet his hands are tied because the prince has the entire military force under his sway. Besides, a much-respected commander who boasts of 10 years' worth of victories on the battlefield cannot be ousted so easily, and it would throw the entire nation into disarray. Seemingly confused by his words, Sealha probes further, and just then, he reveals that he wants her to end the life of the prince. In addition, he says that if she gets caught in the act, she must keep her mouth shut or she'll forfeit the life of her beloved nursemaid. To him, this should be enough to strengthen her resolve. As if that was not enough, he decides to let her in on a not-so-little secret. Now, here's the shocker, it was Prince Muan who brought her to the harem. He explains that it was the prince himself who took her from her mother's arms and brought her to the harem. Naturally, that action raised some questions. Was it really a mass suicide that destroyed her people, or was it his butcher of a brother, who, feeling the sting of humiliation, slaughtered all the women in a murderous rage? Though she finds it hard to believe this revelation, he recalls her supposed first time meeting Prince Muan and his comment that day about her being brave. Thinking to herself, she says that if that day wasn't really their first encounter, he must have known all along how her scar came to be. Sobbing bitterly, she asks the emperor to give her his word to grant her and hers safe passage out of the palace once the prince loses his life. At that moment, he rummages through his attire and swears to bestow upon her a secret missive bearing his seal, and with it, she will be free to enter and exit the palace as she pleases. As he watches her weep, he ponders what face his brother will make once he learns that there is only betrayal there. He inwardly curses at Seelha, saying that he treats her with nothing but affection, yet she dares allow another man her virtue so readily, while she could have told him that she'd rather lose her life. On the other hand, she's lost in her musings too, saying that once Prince Muan lies lifeless, it'll be the emperor's turn, so until then, he should enjoy what little time he has. Later that night, within the confines of her room, Seelha sits there sobbing her heart out. She recalls her outing that night with the prince and questions how he could seem so sweet if he slaughtered her mother and her people. Hearing her cry, Unjong storms in inquiring what the problem is, and she asks her in return if her people really did take their own lives on that fateful day. She shares that she just heard the strangest thing, that the remaining Yul may have been massacred by Prince Muan. Amid her tears, she suggests that they leave the palace, noting that the emperor said he'd set them free if she ended the prince's life for him. Still, one question lingers: can she really do such a thing? The problem there is that the emperor will have their heads for sure if she refuses, so they have no choice but to run. Obviously, their plans are foiled and they will no longer be able to leave the palace next year, so it's best they just run away. Subsequently, as they are both seated outside making plans for their departure, they decide to leave Hoong behind to save him from further danger. But amid all the mix of emotions, Seelha's mind keeps racing back to the words of Prince Muan. It dawns on her that those weren't the words of a loyal vassal. Perhaps he's also considering a rebellion. This makes her question what the bonds of brotherhood truly entail, considering that they are supposed to care for each other, but Unjong replies saying that not everyone is capable of such sentiments, which is why she considers herself most fortunate to have met with the lady. Then, Seelha apologizes to her for putting her in more danger when she should be protecting her instead. As the night gets thicker, Seelha retires to her room and lights up a candle, but she's unable to sleep as images keep flashing through her mind. Scared and gasping for air, she notices a figure, so she picks up the candle inquiring if there's anyone else there, but the figure grabs the candle and turns it off, asking who else would possibly come to her so late in the night. As she turns over, she realizes that it's Prince Muan, who informs her that he'd planned to visit briefly, but the sight of her bare skin bids him to prolong his stay. As he lays her down on the bed, she inwardly remarks that this is her chance to draw the blade and bury it in his neck. But before we know it, tears fill up her eyes as she reveals that she does not know what lies ahead, and she mentions that she's alone in a world filled with nothing but darkness and she's terrified it will stay that way forever. He reassures her that he's here with her in that darkness of hers while referring to her as my lady, which she promptly cautions him against, saying that she doesn't wish to be reminded of her position in the court. Then she requests that he calls her by her name. Giving him a hug, she mentions that she wants to go outside and she suggests they go to the forest again, but this time around, just the two of them. As they embark on their walk in the forest, Seelha discloses that she heard it was him who first brought her to the palace, and then she inquires if there's anything he can tell her concerning the deaths of her mother and her people. He begins saying that since she had lost consciousness by then, she probably wouldn't remember. However, he doesn't know the details himself, and it was only after he brought her to the palace that he received news of their demise. In addition, all he can tell her is that even the Yul who were found outside the village had succumbed to their demise either by suicide or some other cause. Furthermore, he says that if any Yul had survivor had been found and made a concubine, the emperor would have had her executed. This revelation brings back a memory of the moment the emperor spared her life. As their stroll continues, she declares that she takes no joy in the demise of others, though Prince Muan shares that he can't say the same because her life is the only one that matters to him. Engrossed in her thoughts, Seolha wonders if she can really trust the prince, but she waves it aside and requests that he teach her how to ride a horse. So, he begins lecturing her on the rules to use to ride a horse, referencing it to the way she writhed and moved her body with his on a passionate night they shared. This doesn't sit right with her and she yells, telling him to learn some courtly manners. Following this, he speaks to his horse Hoong, telling it that the person on its back is the one he cherishes the most, so it should take good care of her. Afterwards, she gradually begins riding it, following all the prince's instructions, but just when it seems to be going smoothly, Hoong loses control, frightening her even further. At this point, the prince orders her to trust him and let go of the reins, but she hesitates due to fear. Nonetheless, she eventually gives in by releasing it and the prince rushes to catch her. With a thud sound, they both tumble to the ground, but Seolha remains shielded in his arms. Wrapped in each other's arms, they share a kiss, and Seolha shares that her clothes have been sullied and she wants to wash up. With a smirk on Prince Muan's face, he suggests they go wash up together. As they delve into the river to wash up, she reminisces on the journey that led them there and notes that their current situation doesn't feel appropriate. He embraces her, asking what doesn't feel appropriate while he rips off her clothes. The tension intensifies, building up to an intimate moment. But Seolha takes note of one thing: the moon can never triumph against the sun because its light is but a feeble ray before the sun's radiance, and to compare the emperor and his twin would be to compare a drop of rain to a thunderstorm. If only she could stop at this point, renounce her desires, and end the prince's life with her hands, maybe then she could persuade the emperor to spare her and Unjong. However, if she falls into the abyss all the same, it'll only be a moment's reprieve just until the time comes. The time seems to stretch as their intimate moment lingers. A while later, as they chill by the river bank, Prince Muan calls out her name and asks if she has ever heard the legend of her people and the tale of the heavenly maiden blessed with powers of restoration. She replies by saying that she has heard something of that sort from her mother, that they're descendants of an ancestor who had healing powers. The prince probes further, asking if she knows why the emperor is so desperate to have a Yul woman at his side. He then spills that there is a curse upon the Imperial bloodline. We learn that a long time ago, a heavenly maiden happened upon a dying mortal. Pained at the sight, she fed him her blood and nursed him back to health. The man fell deeply in love with his savior and continued to feign illness to keep her by his side. He was of low birth and humble means, but his heart was pure. The heavenly maiden, who found herself sharing the man's affection, chose to remain in the human realm. She loved him dearly, and not many years later, they had a child of their own. Happiness, however, is a fleeting thing. While they wandered one fateful day, they found a man lying lifeless on the ground. The heavenly maiden rushed to the man, hesitant at first, but considering the amount of blood he had already lost, there was a need to treat him. Her husband was against the idea of helping the stranger upon discovering he was from the Imperial palace. Just then, the man opened his eyes, gasping and begging for help, which she rendered to him. Subsequently, after the man regained consciousness, he questioned his location, wondering if he was still in Tiso. The heavenly maiden's husband didn't accommodate the idea of this strange man being in his house still, so they kept on exchanging words. When his wife even wanted to check up on the stranger, he kept on restricting her from going into the room, all in the name of protecting what's his. Amid their banter, the strange man, who turned out to be the emperor, threatened to make the husband pay with his life, but his wife immediately rushed in, begging for mercy upon her husband. With the emperor's eyes fixated on her, he grasped her hand and asked how she managed to bring him back from death's door. Recalling the incident in his subconscious state, he asked if it was her blood she fed him, but her husband tried to deny it by playing dumb. This did not sit well with the emperor. He roared in anger, questioning their audacity to try to deceive him when he saw everything for himself. He even went as far as accusing them of possibly trying to poison him, but while he was still yelling, their daughter came in to defend her parents. With her eyes filled with tears, she reveals that her mother is a maiden of the heavens and her blood contains the power to heal all wounds. She adds that her parents were merely trying to save his life so he shouldn't hurt them. After a moment of staring, the emperor informed them that he would leave the next day and then tossed an object to the husband, instructing him to take it to the local magistrate and explain what had happened so that he would send guards to escort him back to the palace. With gentle steps, the emperor stepped closer to commend the maiden on her effort in raising her child. One day, while she went to serve his meal, she didn't find him in the room, but she got startled by his sudden emergence from her back. As he arrived, he informed her that he went hunting because she seemed rather ill-fed at a closer look, so he brought her something as a sign of his gratitude. Then, he inquires about her husband's whereabouts, noting that he did not expect him to leave her alone with him. Their conversation lasted for a while, even with the emperor trying to covet the heavenly maiden. Despite all her warnings against his ill speech toward her husband, the emperor stopped at nothing to make sure he ruined the man's image before her, but due to the love and trust she had in her husband, she stepped away from the emperor, holding fire in her hand and saying that if her husband truly loves her for who she is, he won't abandon her come what may. Tears rolled down her cheek as she yelled that she'd always had her suspicions about her husband too, but it had already been 10 years since she came down to the world, and perhaps, she too, had become mortal in mind. With a quest to put an end to the most terrible sin, she took their burning piece of stick in her hand and braced her face with it. The emperor quickly snatched it from her while she slumped to the ground sobbing in pain. She requested the emperor's word that if she could prove that her husband loved more than just her flesh, he would leave them in peace, but her husband's presence interrupted her. While he hadn't seen her face yet, he stepped toward her, explaining that he rushed back to pick up something he had forgotten. Just as she turned her face to him, he hurriedly retreated and warned her against coming closer to him. All her pleading fell on deaf ears, and he just progressed to calling her names. During all this, their daughter rushed out and ran to her mother, inquiring about her well-being. The little girl turned to her father, telling him that her mother was hurt and needed help, but he did nothing. How could the heavenly maiden have known that having her deepest fears prove true would be torture far worse than the sting of scorching her own face? Sobbing bitterly with her daughter by her side, she grabbed her and ran to a nearby cliff, trying to calm the fears of the little child. Surprisingly, the emperor rushed to the scene, promising that her husband would get his due, but remained resolute in his request for her to be his consort, but she angrily halted his speech, blaming him for all that had happened. Gazing at her child, she mentioned that she should have never saved the emperor's life, while she trudged backward to the edge of the cliff. Before they knew it, she had fallen off, with her last words being that she shouldn't have saved her husband. The emperor rushed to her only to find her halfway conscious. He questioned her reason for wanting to take her own life, and she replied by saying it was for love that she chose to remain in the human realm, but now she realizes she was just chasing an illusion. Holding her in his arms, he still asked if she could be with him. He confessed that he never believed in love at first sight until he met her. Then he promised to care for, feed and clothe her if she came with him, but she mentioned that his words were just like that of her husband's, and he will be no different, so he should let her go. Panting heavily, she said that she must return to where she came from before she finally gave up the ghost. The emperor felt that since she had previously fed him with her blood to save him, he could do the same now, so he searched for an object to slit his wrist with. However, he was overcome with grief when he realized his blood was not enough to bring the heavenly maiden back to life. So, he made a plea to the heavens. He implored the powers on high to cast her into a cycle of reincarnation so that he may be reunited with his beloved in another life. The prayer, or rather, the curse, worked too well. Across generations, a prince who bore the same deep scar on his wrist would occasionally spawn from the Imperial bloodline of Tiso, and they were doomed to date their bloodlust each day to keep themselves from spiraling into madness. If they rose to the throne, their succession brought famine and disaster to the nation, and it was almost as though the curse would only end with the heavenly maiden's return. Having learned of the history, Seolha sits in her quarters wondering if this is why Prince Muan hunts every night. She acknowledges that he had no choice, yet she rebukes him with harsh words. She even considers letting him know about her ability, but a question lingers. What if he has known all along? So many questions flood her mind, but what can she do? Her musings are cut short by the presence of Eunjang and Hoong, who have just arrived with her dinner. Eunjang notices her demeanor and asks if everything is all right, but she waves it off with a smile, inquiring if Hoong prepared the meal again. As they all happily converse over the meal, a thud suddenly interrupts them. There goes Yang. Surprised, he questions his brother's ability to now speak, but the young boy immediately starts rendering apologies to his brother for keeping it a secret. His brother, however, seems not to be having it. Yang continues to question this new development, thereby flustering his brother, but as Seolha notices this, she tries to explain that it was all her fault because she told Hoong not to tell anyone. Following his reaction, they all thought Yang was upset, but to their surprise, he embraces his little brother out of excitement, thanking the heavens for his recovery. With teary eyes, Hoong continues to apologize to his brother for not letting him know about his recovery first. Meanwhile, Eunjang and Seolha stand by the corner watching the brothers, while they themselves share such sentiments too. Sometime later, Yang bows to Seolha, expressing gratitude for her aid to her brother, but she counters and shares how much of a help his brother has been to her in her times of loneliness. More so, she adds that she might not be Hoong's blood as he is, but he is no less dear to her. Seeing the turnout of events, she grants the brothers the rest of the day to do some catching up, and then, she also begs him to keep everything from Prince Muan for the time being, her reason being that she'd like to inform him herself in due time. Although Yang says she has their trust for the miracle upon his brother, he spills that keeping secrets from the one he serves is a grave disloyalty, and he implores her not to keep Prince Muan in the dark for too long. Later that night, Eunjang enters the room informing Seolha that she has brought the tools for the renewal of her scar, though she thinks it's still too early to do it. But Seolha thinks otherwise because both Hoong and the prince are absent at the moment, and this seems to be the perfect time. As always, the nursemaid offers to help should she need anything, but she insists that she'll be fine, having grown used to the pain. Engrossed in her thoughts and alone in the room, she inwardly says that if she can just get away from the palace, she'll finally be free of the pain. She asserts that she'll end the life of the prince and escape to a faraway place with Eunjang at her side, but the ultimate question still remains, can she bring herself to do it? Several thoughts run through her mind, and just as she lifts the tool to burn her face, the prince enters, questioning her action. The tool clangs as he hits it to the ground and remarks on the origin of her scar. Frightened, she begins explaining that it was not her intention to mislead him and she was going to tell the truth, but he counters and questions the tenure of the long suffering. For being clueless all along as his beloved inflicted such torture upon herself, he calls himself a most wretched man and embraces her. He acknowledges that she had no other choice, but he promises to make the people who did this to her pay with their lives to deliver her from the suffering. Then, they lock themselves up in an embrace. As they venture into the forest that night, he inquires if she feels better now, and she affirms. She starts confessing that she has the ability to heal injuries and that her blood can treat wounds, just like the blood of the heavenly maiden in the legend. At first, it was just potent enough to heal animals, but as she grows older, her powers grow too, healing even the scar without her will. She further explains that prior to now, she only had to renew the wound every 3 to 6 moons, but now she must do so each month. Prince Muan, loving as ever, claps her hand while he blames himself for being too ignorant. He says he never suspected that she'd be experiencing such pain even whilst he thought he knew it all and had everything under control. Unexpectedly, Seolha informs him that what he said before about ending the lives of those responsible for her suffering really made her happy, despite that she told him to stop taking lives for sport, but this makes her consider herself a wicked person. However, the prince comforts her by stroking her face and saying that the people responsible are the wicked ones and she has endured the pain long enough. While they are still engrossed in that moment, a rustling sound from the forest draws their attention, and it turns out to be a bear and her cub. Prince Muan mentions going to hunt the animal for her, but she immediately reminds him that she takes no joy in slaughtering, but if he must do it, then he should slaughter the cub too, because it wouldn't be able to survive on its own. In the next scene, we witness the prince finally hosting the presence of the grand preceptor he has long awaited. After a brief exchange of words between them, he informs the preceptor that he needs a favor from him, citing the similarity of his calligraphy to that of the late emperor. Then, he reveals the shocking request of wanting the preceptor to draw up a letter for him, specifically a decree fashioned in the late emperor's handwriting. It appears that he wants the preceptor to forge the decree, but the old man reminds him that a bearer of the curse upon the throne will only bring famine and disaster across the nation. Leaning in closer, the prince asks the man if all that he has mentioned is any different from what's happening presently, citing the emperor who prefers chasing skirts to ruling over his subjects. He adds that the realm is overrun with corrupt officials and their borders are beset by enemy raiders, yet all of this is under the reign of the one who is supposedly not afflicted by the curse. He even mentions that the curse will be lifted soon, leaving the old man confused, and when he seeks clarity, the prince shares that he has earned the favor of the heavenly maiden. With that piece of information revealed, he urges the preceptor to support his cause. Meanwhile, in Sealha's quarters, she and her nursemaid Unjung can't help but admire the beauty of the blanket the prince sent to them. Suddenly, he bursts in through the window, and so Unjung quickly offers to prepare the table for a meal since he intends to dine with Sealha. With both of them alone in the room, he requests her hand and adorns her with a bracelet resembling that of her mother's. To him, Sealha seemed to hold her mother's memory close, and that's why he thought to gift her the bracelet, but he's shocked to find out that it wasn't as he thought. Leaning closer, he casually mentions that his intention was to remedy her pain, but it appears he's only made it worse. Then he kisses her and jests about his cluelessness in the ways of the heart. As he takes off her clothes and caresses her body, he remarks that this is a province he's more well acquainted with. Sealha, in return, notes that nothing is unwelcome as long as they're together. So, they delve deeper into intimacy, even ignoring Unjung's presence outside the room. Amid their shared intimate moment, Sealha notes that she was blind to all else but the prince. All other sounds faded and she could feel nothing, not even the heat of the glaring sun. A moment turned eternal and a dream unending. Later that night, Sealha comes knocking at Unjung's room hoping to share the bed with her for the night. Sealha indulges her maid in a conversation, sharing her regret for falling for Prince Muan. She almost wishes he's just toying with her and that he only approached her to take advantage of her power without truly loving her, for she thinks that would put her mind at ease. On the other hand, there's Prince Muan who has gone hunting again with his servant, Yang. The loyal servant notices how rested the prince seems while noting that the symptoms of the curse seem to trouble him less and questions him about it. He replies by saying that he has Sealha to thank for it. Curiosity piqued, Yang probes further, daring to ask if the prince was aware of Sealha's special ability from the beginning. In response, the prince starts to spill that he never anticipated any of this, and he thought he knew everything there was to know, yet, he was none the wiser. More so, he thought all that mattered was that he deliver Sealha from his brother's clutches. 15 years ago, when Prince Muan first encountered Sealha, he was on tour around when a servant then showed him the Yul clan settlement. The servant shared that the Yul women are often targets of abduction, so they ate under Imperial protection. As he walked by, he noticed the little Sealha in tears with her maid trying to calm her down. She was such a beautiful child indeed. When he returned to the palace, his brother rushed to him to inquire if he really met the last of the Yul and if she was as beautiful as people say, but he replied that she was just a little girl. His brother, the emperor, however, insisted that no matter what, he'd take her as his concubine. Furious yet respectful, the prince reminded him that he already had 5 consorts in his harem, but the nonchalant emperor emphasizes that his wish is to be remembered as the ruler with a Yul as his consort. Curiously, the prince asked what would happen if the last Yule girl refused to be his consort, and his brother replied by saying that if she were to defy an imperial decree, he'd have to end her life, although it would be a great pity to let the Yule line perish. Then, he mentioned that she'd meet her end after she bore his children. What a ruthless ruler they have here. A memory suddenly flashes through his mind about a previous fire incident. In the heat of trying to escape the fire with 2 servants, he insisted on not letting go of his dagger, which fell behind as they were running out. The female servant offered to go back to pick up the dagger but ended up getting consumed by the fire before she could make it out. Despite all her cry for help, the emperor just stood there watching her burn before the other male servant carried him out of the scene. In another scene, the young Prince Muan is engrossed in a conversation with Sealha's mother, where she was informed of the offering of her daughter as a congratulatory gift for the accession of the emperor. He explained that his brother has an insatiable penchant for beautiful women and their consent matters little to him. With a gloomy face, Sealha's mother realized that the tales of the emperor's wanton ruthlessness had finally reached her ears. So, she asked the prince to tell her how the emperor's women fare in the harem, and he replied by saying they are kept in the harem until they are cast out as cripples or corpses. After that, he mentioned that he'd like to share a story with her. Then, he began the tale telling, the year he turned 10, the late emperor gifted him a folding screen that detailed an old legend about the Yule clan and the nation of Tiso. It tells the tale of a maiden of the heavens who wed a human and gave him a child, and an emperor who fell in love with her at first sight. Naturally, he sought to take her with him to his palace. He told the heavenly maiden that her husband loved only her pretty face and whispered seduction into her ears. The maiden, powerless to deny the emperor, suggested a pact. She would test her husband by marring her face with a most hideous scar, and should her husband love her regardless, the emperor must then leave her in peace. Trusting her husband's love, the maiden proceeded to ruin her face, only to discover that the emperor had been right all along. Abandoned by the man she loved, the despairing maiden took her own life. That much of the tale is known to all, but there was more in that folding screen which was an untold part of the story, Prince Muan said to her. Truthfully, the emperor tried to protect the heavenly maiden right up until the very end. After all, the state of her face mattered not to him, and by then, he had come to love the maiden for who she truly was. Despite hearing all this, Sealha's mother mentioned that from her view, both the emperor and the husband of the maiden were at fault, and their obsession with her beauty was what pushed the maiden toward her tragic end. But the prince interjected in disagreement and said that the maiden belonged with the emperor from the beginning, and he would have made her happy regardless of her appearance. After a brief silence, he mentioned that he could be the loving emperor of the legend for Sealha as long as she could endure life in the harem for 10 years. Furthermore, he urged her to note that he isn't his brother and that his yearning for her daughter is not one of carnal obsession. He pledged to protect her daughter from the emperor, but in order to do that, he needed her help. He spilled that Sealha carries the blood of the Yule within her veins, and for that, the emperor cannot slaughter or cast her away at whim. Amid his speech, she got up and stepped away from him, inquiring if what he meant was that the only way for her daughter to survive was to become the last living Yule, for she would no longer hold value in the emperor's eyes. Curiously, she asked if she was to scar her daughter's face like that of the heavenly maiden of the legend, and the prince affirmed. After all her inquiries, she decided to trust Prince Muan to keep his word while stating that life as a Yule had been nothing but one of suffering. With this, she entrusted her daughter to his hands. In the present, Prince Muan arrives at Sealha's quarters but is informed by Unjang that she isn't in her bedchamber. She says that the lady slept in her quarters last night, and this made the prince query if there was a problem, but Unjang responds by revealing that Sealha seeks her company from time to time when her worries trouble her at night. Curiosity piqued, and the prince probes further, seeking more insight on the said worries. So, Unjang begins to spill that Sealha heard some rumors, and they say he was utterly displeased by the sight of her marred face, so much so that her people did not take their own lives but had been slaughtered by him instead. Upon hearing this, he scoffs and asks who dared to spread such talk, but Unjang immediately falls to the ground, pleading that if there's indeed no truth to the rumors, he should talk to Sealha because she's really upset. Also, the more she grows to enjoy his company and cherish his presence, the more the rumors torment her. As she continues to plead, the prince orders her to rise and agrees to talk to Sealha about it. Subsequently, she wakes up in the arms of the prince with a smile beaming on her face, questioning how she got here, but he tells her that he carried her in his arms back to her bed chamber. He even mentions that she hardly stirs when she sleeps and not even a shrieking storm could have roused her. Defensively, she informs him that she's usually a light sleeper, but perhaps resting in his embrace kept her from waking. They share a kiss and then he reveals that there's something she must know, and it concerns the Yul and her mother. Trembling and quivering, she asks if he knew that her mother and the entire clan were going to take their own lives, to which he affirms and remarks that it was for her sake because keeping her alive was the only thing that mattered. Angrily, she asks if he did consider what would come next for the lone survivor. As if that was not enough, she begins venting, saying that she's shunned and reviled at court, and nothing pleases the emperor more than seeing her choke on her tears. Also, she has braved the pain of burning her own face for the smallest chance of leaving the palace, but now she finds herself doubting whether she'll ever be free. Moreover, not a day goes by that she does not resent her mother for leaving her to suffer alone. But the worst part of it is that for all the blame that she places on her mother, she finds herself selfishly praying for her life whenever she hears that another Yul survivor has been found somewhere. Though the prince's company has granted her some respite, there's no changing of the cruel reality, and the day the emperor finds another Yul to replace her is the day she'll lose her life. The prince assures her that no other survivors will be found, and he shall see to it as he has done thus far. He shares that the remaining Yul who lived away from the clan settlement have already been taken care of. To add to that, he says that when the whereabouts of a survivor reach him, he's the first to arrive and slay her, just to keep Sealha safe. This doesn't sit well with her, and she abruptly interrupts him, yelling that he should quit saying this is all for her. Sobbing, she asserts that he should not shed any more blood for her sake. She even questions if living out her days in the palace for robbing all those lives is her punishment. As the prince tries to touch her to calm her down, she warns him against laying his hands on her and orders him to leave because she never wants to see him again. To Prince Muan's surprise, she calls him a murderer. Meanwhile, entering the emperor's quarters, just as he lays down to sleep, he ponders not the fact that Sealha has feelings for his brother and gets intimate with him. He inwardly says that all he needs to do is take Sealha and put a child in her belly, but it turns out that her tainted face seems to be the only problem. Suddenly, he beckons one of the eunuchs to bring the Yul girl to him immediately, alongside her nursemaid, Unjang. In his words, unruly wives must be disciplined. They arrive at the emperor's quarters greeting him meekly. Just then, he informs Sealha that he called her because he has something to give her. To her surprise, he places a knife in her hand in a form clasp and mentions that he had it sharpened just for her, and he shall instruct her in the way of the blade. As he orders her to rise, he remarks that he realizes he sent her on a secret mission without first equipping her with the required skills. He mentions that one cannot hope to slaughter their target without knowing how to wield their weapon, so he urges her to take the day's lesson to heart and remember it when she performs the deed. With Unjang standing before them, he commands her to raise her head and continues teaching Sealha. He says that the first thing to bear in mind when slaughtering a mark is to grip her weapon firmly and aim for the throat. At this point, she was already crying her eyes out in fear, but Unjang whispers, assuring her that it'll be all right. He grabs her hand with the knife in it to show her how it's done, swinging it against the nursemaids, but he misses the aim at her throat and slits her cheek instead. Just as he tries to aim for the second time, the knife drops out of Sealha's hand because of how tense she is. She instantly starts begging for his forgiveness and promises to commit herself to his order at the first opportunity, so he should give her a little more time. Before she can complete her plea, he interjects saying that in 15 days, a grand hunt will be held and an unfortunate accident will befall the prince on the very first day. After all, hunting grounds are not known for being safe. Nonetheless, he fears that his brother, being the resilient man that he is, will not succumb so easily, so it falls on her to ensure that he takes his last breath. As he releases her hand from his grip, he casually instructs her to slaughter him and run, as the guards will not give chase, but for her own sake, she should not fail. Later that night, as Seolha and her nursemaid return to her quarters, Eunjong tries calming her down by assuring her that she is perfectly fine. But she continues to cry, saying she thought she was going to lose her just like that, with her blood on her hands. Eunjong takes her hand, urging her to listen closely to what she's about to say. Then she spills that if she may meet her end at the hands of another, Seolha should know that it's not her fault. Also, she must not put the blame on herself nor seek to avenge her, because she does not wish to be the yoke that keeps her from the happiness she deserves. With an embrace, Seolha asserts that she does not need Prince Muan or anyone else, and all that matters is that she has Eunjong. She promises not to fail, and they'll leave the palace and find happiness. All they have to do is focus on getting out alive together. That night, Seolha had a dream that filled her with indescribable joy. In the dream, she was chasing a yellow butterfly, and she knew not where it led her, but she found herself surrounded by a vast expanse of beautiful white flowers. It was only when a soft breeze scattered the petals into the sky that she realized the field was a secret haven of butterflies. She wanted to catch one for herself, so she raised her hand into the sky to reach for the brilliant golden wings, and then, she met a little girl. Her giggle was clear and musical, as she placed the butterfly she so desired in her hand. It was a most joyful dream for her. Could this be a conception dream? The next day during mealtime time, Eunjong notices that Seolha isn't eating, so she's forced to ask if the meal isn't to her liking, but she responds by saying that she just doesn't have much of an appetite. So, Eunjong inquires if there's anything else she'd like, and surprisingly she says she's craving pomegranates all of a sudden. Noting how difficult it is to find, the nursemaid promises to check at the market but pleads that Seolha eats some more of what's available for now. Just as Seolha is about to speak, a sudden retch takes over her, raising questions. Then, Eunjong begins investigating, asking if she's bled yet for the month, but she responds by saying she's late by about 10 days. She throws another question, asking if the lady has been feeling nauseous or lightheaded, to which she affirms. The maid then reveals that when Seolha's late mother was pregnant with her, she, too, had a craving for pomegranates. It was then it dawned on her that the dream she had was a conception dream. Just then, Prince Muan's voice cuts in, requesting to come into her chambers. He came bearing the pomegranates she craves, noting that they were difficult to come by. He even mentions that he traveled all the way to the southern reaches to get them for her. She takes the fruit from his hand and thunks it on the table, saying she didn't ask for it. Wondering why he must trouble her, she requests that he leave her alone to wallow in her contempt for him. Clenching his lips, the prince acknowledges that the blame is entirely his, so she can keep hating him if that is her wish, or reproach him until her anger is spent. He urges her to treat him as she sees fit, but she shouldn't spurn his gesture. He kneels and remarks that the coming winter will be especially harsh, so she needs the supplies he brought her. He also notes that she's already lost her color in the time he's been away. Following this, Eunjong reminds Seolha that the Empress's tea ceremony will commence soon and attending empty-handed would be inappropriate, but they have no way of procuring an acceptable gift, hence they should accept the prince's generosity because it couldn't have come at a better time. Subsequently, the Empress's event commenced and the Empress acknowledges the gift of pomegranates and also seeks to know the bearer of such a precious gift. One of the ladies mentions that it's a gift from Seolha, courtesy of Prince Muan, perhaps. She even reveals what she heard about the prince being most fond of her. While they are still talking about Seolha's relationship with the prince, another pregnant consort steps in, begging for the forgiveness of the Empress for her inability to bow to her due to her pregnancy. Their conversation about the pregnancy leaves Seolha pondering the fact that they treat children as leverage to get what they want. She can't help but throw a question at the pregnant consort, asking what kind of mother she wants to be for her child. The pregnant lady seems flustered by the question, so Seolha explains that since the consort is so expectant to give birth, she just assumed she'd have given it some thought. However, the consort still insists that her duty stops at delivery and she need not do more. Angered by this statement, Sealha grits and tells her that some mothers sacrifice their lives for their children, and compared to their example, she seems to be lacking such maternal affection. She continues to say that a mother's duty stops not at delivery, and she's surprised that the pregnant lady would think otherwise. This stirs murmurs and whispering amongst other women, but the pregnant lady reminds Sealha that this is the Imperial Palace, where deadly intrigues abound. She announces her intention to survive this most unforgiving place, and if she must use her child to that end, then so be it. This lady goes as far as saying that she'd like to see Sealha suit her actions to her words once she comes to be with a child of her own, although she doubts she's much of an authority on the subject. As if that was not enough, she probes further, inquiring if it wasn't Sealha's mother who left the hideous scar on her face. They jest and laugh over it for a while until Sealha rises up from her seat and affirms the earlier statement. However, she asserts that her scar serves as a reminder that her mother gave her own life to save her, and she's proud to call herself her daughter. When she returns to her quarters after the event, she asks Unjong if perhaps her mother felt the same way she feels now, but the nursemaid, obviously confused, seeks an explanation. So, Sealha starts to explain her worry. She questions if they'll be able to escape before she gives birth, and also how long she will be able to keep it from the Emperor. Yet, despite all this, she finds herself wondering who the child will resemble more, she or Prince Muan. She's eager to keep the child safe, whatever the cost. After a moment of silence, Unjong reveals that her mother was indeed the same, and then a memory from the past clouds her mind. Then, Sealha shares how she's resented her mother all the while without even attempting to understand the sacrifice she made, but Unjong comforts her by advising her not to blame herself because her mother was not hoping for her understanding, rather, all she wanted was for her to lead a long and happy life. With this knowledge, she swears to find happiness for both her and her child. Unjong, the ever-loyal servant, then mentions stopping the lady's tears first, and for this, she probably has the perfect idea in mind. She informs her that the past few days of rain filled their well to the brim, and they now have enough water to spare. So, she suggests a nice bath before winter comes, ensuring Sealha that she'll feel much better after soaking herself in the warm water. During her bath time, Prince Muan staggers in with blood all over him, but before she can inquire about his well-being, he grabs and kisses her. He now explains that the smell of blood is the only thing that lulls him to sleep without her in his arms. On the other hand, she says she understands that it's the curse, but it won't do, so he should get washed up first. Just then, she reveals that there's something he must know. While she cleans him up, she asks if he's plotting a rebellion, but in response, he asks her if it would make a difference if he said yes. This draws her into a moment of musing. She inwardly remarks that the grand hunt begins in 2 days, and that is when Prince Muan will take up his sword against the Emperor, but will he be able to triumph over a man who spills blood so ruthlessly? She notes that if the prince fails, she and her child will perish. However, if they are to survive, is slaughtering the prince the only way? If only she could just convince him to escape with her. He notices her engrossed in her thoughts and inquires what it is about, and then she mentions that he should leave the palace with her in search of a quiet life, where nobody will find them. Gazing at her, he asks if she still wishes to escape even though he would do anything to protect her, and she replies by saying she's weary of it all and wishes to bid this life farewell. Alas, he can't let her escape, so he prompts her to ask for anything else and it'll be hers, but not escaping. Then, he pulls her closer and begins kissing her, saying that she could never begin to imagine just how dear she is to him. Noticing how she keeps on resisting when he tries to take off her clothes, he's forced to ask if her bleeding has started, to which she affirms negatively. So, he begs that she allow him to worship what he loves, but she stops him again, saying she doesn't want that now. The prince stares at her and asks if she's still vexed with him, but she replies that there's just a lot on her mind at the moment. Hearing this, the prince insists that if his presence indeed does not displease her, she should allow him to hold her at the very least. As he holds her in his arms, she asserts that he will not shy away from whatever he must do to keep her safe, and he'll slaughter them all if he has to. Meanwhile, she inwardly begs for his forgiveness, for if he will not come with her, she must save their child's life at the expense of his own. In the next scene, we see Seolha about to enter into a tent, but she halts and reflects on the words the emperor previously said in her ears. Upon entering the tent filled with soldiers, her mind drifts once more, saying that if she had just put more faith in Prince Muan, or if she had feared the emperor less, would that have made any difference to the prince's future and hers? As she steps in, Prince Muan takes her hand and expresses his happiness in her presence, even though she's there at the emperor's invitation. She informs him that the emperor sent for her to attend to his brother's needs. The prince sheds her into his tent, promising that she'll find it much warmer and safer. Noting how the cold snaps of early winter are not to be underestimated, he hands her a pelt to keep herself warm, because she has more than herself to think about, after all. Does he already know about the pregnancy? Just as she's about to ask him a question, one of his eunuchs storms in to inform him that the preparations are complete, and also that a pack of wolves has been spotted to the west and the men are ready to depart. He promises to catch the pack leader for Seolha to warm her bed with its pelt, but she declines, saying that such grand trophies ought to be offered up to the heavens and not her. He plants a kiss on her forehead and mentions that every single day, he has been offering sacrifices without fail, so surely the heavens will forgive him for making an exception. On his way out, he orders one of the servants to tell the hunters to spare the mothers and their young ones while hunting. As he steps outside the tent, Seolha runs after him, begging him not to go while the emperor makes his way into the scene. She shares that she had an unsettling dream about him last night, prompting him to ask if she saw him riding out to his demise in the dream. She affirms, still insisting that she fears he may be gravely injured out there. She acknowledges that it's only a dream, but she should not go. Then the emperor appears before them, smirking and signaling to his brother that they should go. On hearing this, Seolha bows her face in sadness, but Prince Muan urges her to wait for him in his tent, because seeing her safe and unharmed is reward enough for him. He's such a sweet soul, isn't he? After this, he sets out, leaving her behind. While watching him walk away, she threatens that if he gets hurt, she'll be forced to make a most horrific decision. Before we know it, the prince is rushed back to his tent seriously wounded, and his life gradually slipping out of his hands. All efforts to revive him proved futile, and even the court physician couldn't come to his aid. In that moment, Seolha requests that she be given an opportunity to tend to the prince, because there's no more time to waste, and at this point, not even a maiden of the heavens could bring back a lifeless man. After her request has been granted, she takes out the knife the emperor once gave her and remarks that now is her chance, and if she ends his life and runs, she'll finally be set free. Fully drowning in her tears, she raises the knife, and before we know it, news of her assassinating the prince and fleeing spread around. As the prince's eunuch, Yang chases after her and Unjang, he says to himself that he suspected something was wrong when he went hunting with the prince. The wolves were behaving oddly, and the prince seemed to be their only target. Coupled with the way he easily gave up himself to one of the beasts in the forest and handed Seolha's protection into his hands. Still, on the chase for Seolha, he makes use of his arrow and bow to bring her down. Meanwhile, Prince Muan's body had already been sent back to the palace, where his brother, the emperor, covers him and publicly displays fake grief. He announces his brother's demise to the people and even says that in honor of his service and loyalty, he grants him the emperor's regalia, which shall serve as his shroud. Then, he declared a period of mourning, for the realm has lost its protector. He assures the people that his men are already in pursuit of the assassin and her accomplices who took the prince's life in cold blood, and also promises that they shall be sentenced to death by 1,000 cuts. While the people continue to wail, an eunuch whispers to the emperor, informing him that the Grand Preceptor and the 3 ranking ministers are on their way with the rest of the court in tow. Upon their arrival, the emperor angrily orders the people to stop their wailing and be quiet. So, the Grand Preceptor reveals that he has brought before them the late emperor's testamentary edict. Known to the emperor, The previous emperor's last will supersedes the authority of the next ruler. Then, he proceeds to read the content before the court for all to bear witness. It entails that, should the late emperor's eldest son, rightful successor and heir, which is Prince Muan, return alive from battle, he shall ascend the throne and be hailed Emperor of Tiso. In a tense manner, the emperor scoffs and says that nothing can be done because the eldest prince lies lifeless. As he speaks, the piece of cloth he used to cover the prince drops to the ground, leaving the people gasping in surprise. To everyone's surprise, Prince Muan rises and declares that he's very much alive. We're shocked to learn that during the time Sealha was left alone with the prince, she used her blood to save him rather than slaughter him. For the reason that the emperor would have her head for saving his brother, she had no choice but to run as far as her legs would take her, bidding the prince to forget her and find his own happiness. Following the declaration of his life, Prince Muan urges the Grand Preceptor to reread the will to his brother's hearing. So, the Grand Preceptor begins reading it, and this time around, he adds that in the event of the firstborn prince's demise, the throne shall pass to his brother, Prince Youngyeom, but until such a time comes, the court shall form a regency council and await his return. With this, all other last wills before now are declared null and void. After reading this, he salutes Prince Muan, the rightful emperor, and the people join him to kneel before their new emperor. Angered by this new development, the emperor yells, asking if he has not been a generous ruler to them. All the while, they still now to Prince Muan. Trembling, the emperor moves toward the Grand Preceptor and snatches the will, claiming that it must have been forged because he revealed no such thing when the late emperor passed. Raging with anger, he questions why he should bring it up now, and the prince replies by saying that it's because they had to wait for him as it stated in the will. He also explains that he was busy securing their borders following the war while the emperor maneuvered at court to take the throne. Then, he grabs the will from his brother and further explains that he was forced to make daily offerings for 10 whole years to implore the heavens to lift his curse. Seeing this as an opportunity, the emperor shouts and tells the people that his brother has incurred the wrath of the heavens and that the realm will be plagued by famine and disaster if they let him take the throne. To his utmost surprise, the Grand Preceptor shares that the curse has been lifted because Prince Muan has earned the love of a maiden of the heavens, so he has been freed from the influence of the cursed star. Wondering who the maiden of the heavens is, the emperor bursts into laughter, saying that Sealha no longer lives. This news stirs whispers amongst the people as they question if the curse upon the prince will return and if he is really fit to rule without her. With gentle strides, he steps closer to his brother and draws out a sword, saying that the people seem unsure as to who they should serve. Then he slashes his brother's face with the sword and remarks that he may be the persecutor of the woman he loves, but he's also his brother, and for this, he'll show mercy and grant him a quick demise. As he goes after his brother who's trying to run away, he orders the Grand Preceptor to prepare a state funeral and promises to return shortly. As the emperor runs into the forest, he accidentally slips and falls into the den. There he tells his brother that their father chose him and he took his hand as he lay dying and proclaimed him emperor. Before he can finish explaining, the prince confirms his statement to be true and confesses that he had the decree forged, though he doubts it would matter much to his vassals. It's obvious they all want him gone, and this indeed marks the end of his tyranny. While they still indulged in the farewell conversation, the wolves in the forest began to show up around the emperor, who was already seated in their den. So, Prince Muan shares a secret: when a shaman works their spell on a beast, they ensure it remembers the face of their target, but in this instance, their faces, since they happen to share the same. By this time, the wolves dig into the emperor, tearing him into pieces, and that indeed marks the end of his existence. Gazing skyward, the prince hopes for Sealha's safety wherever she is. 6 months later, Sealha is seen sitting in a garden alone until Unjong goes to her inquiring if she's waiting for the butterflies again, to which she replies that she'd like to be the first to welcome the butterflies, so she decided to stop by. As she caresses her bump, she mentions that her own little butterfly seems to like the garden too. Chilling in the garden, Sealha asserts that it's hard to believe that they're really there at times, and it almost feels like a dream. She recalls that if it weren't for General Yang, they may not have escaped with their lives, considering that he saved them from the hands of the other guard chasing after them when they fled from the palace. He told her then that the prince sent him to accompany her to safety, almost as if he knew she would save his life. Unjong notices that she misses Prince Muan, noting how she always comes to the garden. She knows that those butterflies are not the only visitors she hopes to receive. However, Seolha believes that the prince will not come because she's only the former concubine of the previous emperor. In Unjong's words, to think that the prince would forsake Seolha after professing his undying love, she thinks it's best for the lady to put him out of her mind because it might be for the best. After their heart-to-heart conversation, Unjong suggests they head back with hopes that the butterflies might visit the next day. As they rise to get going, lo and behold, Prince Muan appears with his entourage, bearing the exact yellow butterflies she longed for. He apologizes for being late and explains that he wanted to ensure everything was settled before they could have the honor of receiving her into the palace. He comments on how different she looks and attributes it to the fact that she's with a child. They exchange compliments while she addresses him by Your Majesty, which he warns her against and insists that she addresses him as she always has. But can she dare do that when he's the ruler of the nation now? To her surprise, he informs her that she'll soon join him as the Empress. Perplexed, she calls herself unworthy because she was a concubine of the late emperor's harem. He drops another shocker, asking if it's also because she tried to have him slaughtered under his brother's orders. Surprised that he knew all along, she asks why he didn't confront her, and he replies by saying that he was waiting for her to make her choice. Moreover, he would have gladly died at the will of her hands had she carried out the deed. Consequently, he kneels before her and begins saying that she's the very reason that he's here today, and even in such dire circumstances, she risked her life to save his own. Besides, as the single greatest contributor to his rise, her rightful place is at his side, where no one is better suited. He expresses gratitude to her for her forgiveness for all the pain he's caused her in the past while rubbing her belly. She shares that the garden resembles the field of flowers she saw in her conception dream, and it's been her wish to see the butterflies up close. After hearing this, he obliges and permits that the garden should be the birthplace of their firstborn but not the second, because once he brings her back to the palace, he hopes she will never again leave his side. Curiously, she asks what would happen if she decides to return to the garden, and he replies by saying that they would return together, but for now, she should feast her eyes on the butterflies she so wished to meet. Afterward, he cautions her against staying out for too long because of the sunlight burns, but she gives the sweetest reply he would have ever wished to hear. She says that nothing could hurt her now that he's finally with her. 7 years later, amid the bustling city, Unjong links up with a certain master song whom she appears to have found love in. She informs him that she has to return to the palace a little earlier because Seolha, now Her Majesty's firstborn, was appointed crown princess the previous day, and she has requested her presence at the palace after the ceremonial procession. Unjong tells her newfound lover that she's a barren woman and cannot bear him children. She asks again if he's certain this is what he wants. The man seems to care less about that, so she asks him again if he would still feel the same if she were to tell him that she's a Yul. Surprisingly, he grabs her hands and says that should not matter because he loves her for who she is. If anything, he'd have more respect for her. They share this romantic moment discussing about themselves before they are abruptly interrupted by the announcement of the presence of the emperor. The young princess inherited her mother Seolha's looks, but her formidable nature more resembles her father's. As the emperor refused to take in any concubines who could provide male heirs, his only daughter was proclaimed the first crown princess of Tiso. Hoong was made the youngest chief eunuch in the history of the nation, and General Yang now serves the emperor as his right-hand man and the grand commandant of the realm. And as for Unjong, we can clearly see that she's relishing her newfound life of freedom and joy outside the palace. For Seolha, the new empress, the burning scar of anguish no longer taints her face, for the time of grief and suffering has finally passed. Now, only a radiant smile graces her lips as she rests in the living shade of her moon. With this dark yet beautiful story comes to an end. If you enjoyed it, let us know in the comments. Also, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, ciao.